Brought to you by the Astro Youth House chapter from STEM Arts Lab, Space on Earth is a student-led podcast that inspires listeners who are curious about space to explore the wonders of the universe through the voices of young thinkers, creators, and dreamers.
Each episode blends personal curiosity with scientific discovery, from the mysterious depths of black holes to the practical impacts of space on Earth, like GPS, climate science, and medicine.
Hosted by STEM Arts students from Taos, New Mexico, this podcast draws connections between space, art, and science, how these things all impact us here on Earth, and their meaning to humanity.
You'll hear raw, insightful conversations about topics like light pollution, the overview effect, lunar exploration, and the societal impact of the space race.
Whether you're into exoplanets, dark energy, or just stargazing from your backyard, Space on Earth makes space personal, accessible, and inspiring. We believe that space isn't just for astronauts and scientists, it's for everyone.
Join us on this adventure as we explore the cosmos from Earth, one story at a time.
Special thanks to the Lore Foundation for helping launch this podcast.
Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Space on Earth. My name is Taylor.
And my name is Pascal.
And today we're going to be talking to you guys about a really fun topic, and that is how space and science impact pop culture. Whether this is talking about movies, music, all sorts of stuff like that. Space has been a huge influence. And some really popular examples that come to mind are Star Wars, Interstellar, more recently Project Hail Mary. So we're really going to be diving into all of those. And starting with just one of the most iconic space franchises of all time, Pascal, do you want to talk about Star Wars for a bit?
Yeah, I'd love to. So, I don't know if anybody else can relate to this. I presume so. But when I was little, I had an older brother. And maybe for you all, it wasn't an older brother. But he and his best friend would talk about Star Wars all of the time, right? And the thing that really was like captured them and made it so cool for them was that they had this expansive area that they could imagine themselves into. And so, what Star Wars really did with the genre of science fiction is they took this and they they created all of these worlds that you could then explore through your own imagination. And so, Star Wars is technically science fiction, but it's technically science fiction, but its subgenre is sci-fantasy. So it takes the setting of space and like the universe, but doesn't often adhere to a lot of like actual scientific principles and plays a bit more with magical elements. Think the Force. Lightsabers are kind of sciencey, but also lean more to that magical fantasy side of science or lean more to that magical side of space fantasy. And so Star Wars prioritizes storytelling over its scientific reasoning and scientific realism. So a couple more concrete examples is in space, they'll have these big space fights, dog fights with spacecrafts, and you'll hear explosions and laser blasts. But in reality, space is a vacuum, and so sound cannot travel without air. And so in reality, those kind of crazy crashes, explosions, you wouldn't hear as much, or in fact, at all. Similarly, the dogfights that you'd often see on the screen in Star Wars would not actually look that way if they were in real life, because the way that the film directors set up those dogfights, the way the ships move through the air, they fly more like our airplanes these days. They fly as if there was air resistance. Compared to if there were actual dogfights in space, there wouldn't be any wind resistance, and so they move using inertia. There'd be no atmospheric drag, and so there wouldn't be sharp turns because of the amount of energy it'd take to stop and change direction so quickly. Another example of the kind of loose rules that Star Wars plays with within its science fiction is that it plays with hyperspace travel. The what is that called? The hyperspace like lever, and all of the light turns into stripes and you can go through space and suddenly you're at another place hundreds of light years away. But in reality, we can't travel faster than light because it violates Einstein's relativity. And so that's not really possible within our current day physics. But it's fun to watch on screen. So, not a lot of that is realistic, but they did get some fun little tidbits in there. For example, planets like Tatooine, which have two suns, one seemed kind of crazy and out there. We only have one sun. It didn't really make sense that there'd be multiple suns. But astronomers have since discovered that there are planets with two suns called binary stars. And then, of course, you also have the droids like R2D2, who are definitely futuristic, but also these days we're coming closer to those becoming more of a reality as AI and robots are catching up. And also inspires kids and adults alike to look out into the stars and imagine what other planets and people and what another future could be, which I think is so cool. How about you, Taylor? What's your
Um,
experience with Star Wars?
yeah, so I also grew up watching the Star Wars movies, and but I was a kid who was, like, really interested in space, and so I just gravitated toward media with space in it, and so Star Wars was a big one for me. And I think that when you talk about Star Wars in terms of pop culture, what it really did is it set the stage for how popular space became in movies and in media. And now space is still a really big topic. And one of the most famous examples of that is Interstellar, which came out fairly recently. It's a Christopher Nolan film. It's incredible. I highly recommend it. And then you also have movies like The Martian or Project Hail Mary, which just came out recently this year. And these are all really more modern films, and they go about sci-fi in a very different way from Star Wars. So Pascal, kind of like how you were saying Star Wars is a lot more like space fantasy than it is science fiction. Space movies that we see now are typically a bit more realistic and on the science fiction side of things. And so let's dive into some of these big movies. Let's talk about the science behind them and stuff like that. So when I brought this one up, this is Interstellar. And Interstellar just it landed very well in audiences, and it's a very just well-received movie. And part of why the physics and the space science and all of that was so cool and so captivating was because Christopher Nolan worked with physicist Kip Thorne, which helped the film to be grounded in real theory. That way it's not completely far out. So some examples of this is time dilation is a very key concept in the film Interstellar. And we see this on Miller's Planet in the film, how 1 hour equals 7 years on Earth. And this is based on Einstein's theory that time slows down in really strong gravitational fields, like near a black hole. And what's cool about this is that this isn't just completely far out there. We've actually measured time dilation in real life using satellites and atomic clocks, which is super cool. Another really striking and memorable scene from this movie is the black hole scene. And what was really cool about this one is that black hole was modeled using real equations describing how light bends around gravity. How light bends around gravity. And we call this gravitational lensing. And that scene specifically, they put a lot of time and energy into it because they wanted it to have that real touch to it that just made it just another level better. But there's some stuff within that film, of course, that isn't very concrete science. So, for example, like the Tesseract scene inside the black hole, we have nothing in terms of like real current physics to really support that. Same with wormholes. While they're theoretically possible, we've never observed one and they would likely be really unstable. So Interstellar has a bit of both. It has a lot of that real science and that physics to back it up, but with just enough imagination and creativity to make it really interesting. Another really cool film, this one I really like, is The Martian. And what's really neat about The Martian is so a lot of these space films, you're way out in far space, these super crazy concepts. What's really interesting to me about The Martian is that it felt a lot more realistic in the sense that it's just a guy on Mars figuring out how to survive and how to grow food. And there's some even like really small details that were done right in this movie. So, for example, the travel time to Mars being about 6 to 9 months is actually like what NASA mission timelines predict that travel would be. So, that's just some really cool attention to detail. Also, the use of agriculture in that movie and how he goes about making soil, fertilizer, getting water to grow those potatoes, all of that is scientifically plausible. Actually, in fact, there are a lot of missions that work on growing plants in space and figuring out how we do that for any future ideas or plans, which is super cool. And then also, the habitat design was really similar to real experimental habitats that were tested on the ISS for Mars, which is really cool. But of course, with every movie, there's some stuff that The Martian didn't quite get right. Like the dust storm that strands him isn't super realistic because Mars's atmosphere is too thin to produce that kind of force. Also, gravity on Mars is only 38% of Earth's, but the movie doesn't really show how much easier that movement would be on Mars. So, yeah, like there's a few things that they didn't get quite spot on, but for the most part, it's an incredible movie. And that one to me, like I said, stands out because it just feels a lot more realistic than a lot of other space and sci-fi films. And then one of my personal favorites right now that just recently came out, if you haven't gotten a chance to see this, I highly recommend it. This is Project Hail Mary. Project Hail Mary, I think, really landed with audiences for a couple of reasons. Mostly because of how incredible all the sci-fi and science and space topics are in that movie. It's very well done. But also the fact that it lined up with the Artemis 2 mission and this general feeling of how space exploration just feels there's a very hopeful tone to that right now in the culture. And so I think that that's why people loved Project Hail Mary so much. That was definitely something that I really liked about it. And there's some cool stuff with this movie. Like, there's a very strong attention to orbital mechanics, engineering, and astrophysics within this movie. And that's what most of the plot driving science is built on. And it really is one of those movies where the whole time I was watching it, I was just thinking, science is so cool. And it's great to see movies that do that. It also really does have realistic depictions of long distance space travel, constraints, and problem solving, and how difficult those missions are in a real sense. But there's like some things with that movie, as with any, that aren't as realistic. So the idea of the astrophage, which is the microbes that eat stars, it's highly unrealistic. There's no known organism that could survive the extreme energy and conditions of a star. And while that makes it unrealistic, that's also a cool part of the plot of the movie, is really thinking when we see this in Ryland Grace, the main character, in his kind of theories about alien life, of what is out there that works completely different from what we're used to seeing. And so they play with that in terms of microbes eating stars. Also, the rate at which the sun dims in the story is way faster than anything we've observed in real stellar physics. So, even if something were to happen like that, it would probably be like a lot slower paced and a bit less urgent. but that wouldn't make for as fun of a plot. So, yeah, we have those are just three examples of really popular modern movies that dive into space science and do pretty well with it and really kind of balance between real physics-backed science and also creative imagination parts. And so we've been mostly talking about movies, but space is also a huge impact in music. And this is something that Pascal and I are super excited to talk to you guys about is space and music, and particularly a lot of David Bowie's music. Pascal, do you want to get us started on that?
Yeah, I will get started, but first, we've talked about movies, and I want to talk a little bit about some of my favorite books that incorporate science as well. So, is that okay?
Oh, yeah. I've been talking a lot about movies both of us have, but a lot of these movies, like, for example, The Martian and Interstellar, are based on books. And sci-fi and space is a huge topic in writing. And I was hoping, Pascal, could you talk to us a bit more about space science in books?
Yes, I would love to. So, I am a huge reader. I love reading books, and sci-fi and fantasy are my like favorite genres. And so I was thinking as we were preparing for this, what books really captured that sci-fi feeling and how they did that and how they incorporated science into that. And so one book that popped up that was also recently turned into a movie was Dune by Frank Herbert. And Dune, the book, doesn't touch as much on the physics or astrophysics of moving through space, but it does have a very detailed idea of a ecosystem and a world that runs on something so different from our own. Frank Herbert spent so much time creating this world that had its own tree of species and figured out how these different eco ecosystems worked together to create this alien world that is actually could occur in space. And so I think that Dune is a great example of like astrobiology in terms of how he was able to build this world that a lot of people, a lot of scientists recognize as very plausible. And so that's something I find really interesting. I also in we've been talking a lot about the like hard sciences, so like physics, astrophysics, all of these space, astrophysics, biology, those sciences that you think of when you think of space. But I also think there's an element to so much of sci-fi, which is which is looking at social sciences and seeing how different people would or could interact with aliens, right? And so I thought of Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card, who brought a alien species in the first book, Ender's Game, and saw how humanity would interact with that. Very similarly in Project Hail Mary, Andy Weir also did a very similar thing where he brought another species and saw how and predicted how humanity might react as an entity to this other force that needs to be communicated with or figure out how to deal with in a sense. In Project Hail Mary, it was figuring out how to save the world from this non-malevolent, but simply this these microbes that unintentionally destroyed human life. While in Ender's Game, it was a more malicious force. And Ender's Game has several sequels, one of which is Speaker for the Dead, which focuses on humanity's interaction with another species and the cultural clashes that happen within that as well. And so I think there's also this level to a lot of sci fi that not only looks at the hard sciences but also the social aspect of exploring space.
And that's a really cool point to bring up too, is when we look at space and media, how is this, it's a lot more than just the science concepts. I think that space and media, it really represents a lot about humans and how we view the unknown. And, you were talking about examples of humans interacting with alien species. One of my absolute favorite movies that shows this kind of interaction is called Arrival. And I think Arrival is very cool. It's different from your typical alien movie in the sense that it's not as high action, like we're fighting aliens on Earth, but it's about aliens landing on our planet and a woman who studies language being hired by the government to try to communicate with these alien life forms. And this movie does a really good job of showing not only how we learn to communicate and work with beings that are very different from us, but also it has a really interesting take on perspective. The alien life forms in Arrival view time and just the world around them very differently than humans do. And this makes for just a really interesting movie. And then also the scientist who's working on it sees that difference in perspective and can apply it to her own life. And I just think that it's a really cool example of, like you were saying, that social science in and social interaction within space movies. And, since we're talking about how space can represent things, especially if we're talking about the human condition, I think that that's why we see space in music so much. And, an incredible example of this is David Bowie's Space Odyssey. And Pascal, do you want to talk to us a bit about that song particularly?
Yes, I would love to. So, Space Oddity. I remember my family has a record player and we have a I think it's Changes the Collection. And I just remember this song playing all of the time. And I also remember in 3rd grade, a bunch of 6th graders sang the song during an assembly, and it was so cool to me. I loved both the music and also just the atmosphere it created. And Space Oddity has not, of course, I'm not the only person it's made a big impact on. It has been big for the past over 50 years. It's been big for over 50 years. It was released in 1969, right around the Apollo 11 moon landing. And it really tapped into our cultural obsession with space exploration, which around that time, of course, was mostly focused on the moon. But nowadays, as science continues, we can see it reaching farther outward and into other places across stars. And something interesting that Bowie does as a artist, as someone who's sharing an experience, is that instead of focusing on this celebration that was going on for the Apollo 11 moon landing, he focuses a bit more on the possible isolation that one might feel in space. You have this big countdown at the beginning of the song, and then you have this takeoff, and then you hear about the astronaut who's become detached. And so the astronaut, Major Tom, has become a symbol of being detached and this alienation that can happen when you're separated from your species and put out into a place that you look back and can't recognize. And so I think that the song kind of brought this loneliness aspect into the cultural understanding of space, that you could be out here floating and it could be lonely, but it could also be beautiful. And so I think it brings in this idea that space is a metaphor for being emotionally disconnected from Earth and society. So, in other words, I think that Bowie maybe created, maybe captured this idea that space isn't just a place that we go or we can go or that we see. It's also this feeling that we all have inside of us that can be expressed through, you know, a feeling we all have inside of us that he so clearly tapped into with Space Oddity. And do you have anything you want to talk about, Taylor, about Space Oddity or Bowie?
Yeah, so David Bowie, a lot of his career, he had so many just incredible songs that focus on space. You know, you have Life on Mars, you have Starman. Um, I mean, just the whole album, Ziggy Stardust Inspires from Mars, is one of my favorite. And, I think Starman stands out to me a lot because in Starman, space symbolizes hope. And like I was talking about with Project Hail Mary, I think that that's something that we're seeing a lot in pop culture right now is the idea of space exploration as a very hopeful thing. And so songs like Starman really highlight that. Another really famous example of music taking inspiration from space is, of course, Elton John's Rocket Man, and which is an incredible song and so iconic. And I think that what David Bowie and Elton John really have in common is at their time when they were making music, they were really socially far out from the norm. And bass also symbolized being different from what was expected and what symbolizes the unknown. And so I think that that's also something that people have always really connected to with space is there's such infinite possibility. And I think that that's why it becomes such a musical theme is that the norms that we're so used to don't really apply to outer space. And that's why it's so inspiring for songwriters, for screenwriters, people writing novels. And I think that that's just why it's so reoccurring in art and in pop culture. And also, like even in a sense of inspiration and how music was actually being made in the 70s and stuff and going into the 80s when space, like kind of after Space Race, we'd already made it to the moon. Star Wars had become super popular. In music, people were also experimenting a lot more with synthesizers and futuristic sounds. And just kind of that theme of something being very transformative and different, like, out of this world. And I think that that really just it has such a huge ripple effect in where music is now and where media is now. And personally, I think it's really cool that all of that comes from outer space and the science behind that. So I think that's all we have for you guys today. I know I had a really fun time recording this episode, so I hope that you guys love listening to it. And just as a reminder, if you guys ever think of something you're really interested in or curious about space, you can always reach out to us. Check out the STEM Arts Lab website, check out Space on Earth a bit more. Let us know your thought, and we can touch on that and go into your guys' curiosities. So, once again, thank you all so much for listening and supporting us here at Space on Earth. My name is Taylor,
And my name is Pascal.
and we'll see you all next time.